Welcome to Double Trouble, Macdonald-Laurier Institute's foreign policy podcast series, where we explore the implications of an emerging axis of authoritarianism between Russia and China for Canada, for our allies, friends, and the world. Double Trouble is generously supported by the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation's Canada office. I'm your host, Balkan Devlen, Director of the Transatlantic Program and Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and I'm delighted to join today by my co-host, Jonathan Berkshire Miller, who is the Director of Foreign Affairs, National Security, and National Defense at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And we have a lot to talk today, Jonathan.
Yeah, it's great to be on, Balkan. I agree. There's lots to talk about, and let's get right into it.
Yes. So we're recording on January 21st, 2025. This is the first episode of Double Trouble in 2025. We have a lot to cover. What we hope to do for our listeners and viewers today is to provide a sort of a 30,000 feet overview of what lay ahead in 2025. What might Canada and our allies can expect this year, particularly when it comes to dealing with our adversaries. But let us start with the little event that happened yesterday down in South in Washington, D.C., the inauguration of Donald Trump for his second term as president, with a flurry of executive orders ranging from domestic politics to foreign aid to international organizations to security to beyond. And we were in Washington, D.C. last week, had a number of interesting meetings. Jonathan, let me sort of start with that. Well, we're not going to limit ourselves talking about what it means, the second term of Donald Trump for Canada for international security. We will broaden up, but let us get that out of the way first. What's your sort of initial impressions are when you look at from the context of our podcast, how to deal with double trouble that we're facing? What are some of the implications you would say when it comes to Donald Trump coming back?
Well, thanks so much, Balkan. And I think, sometimes it's hard to take this sort of approach when you see all the things that are happening globally and especially in our neighborhood. But I think the first sort of piece of advice is to calm down, slow down, and to relax a little bit when thinking about this. And I know it's hard, especially for politicians in Ottawa or our friend to the south, Mexico, when they're hearing all the threats of tariffs, potentially 25% tariffs that now the president has said may or may not come on February 1st. But I use that old edict and proverb that says, the food is always the hottest when it's being cooked, not necessarily when it's being eaten. So basically, there can be a hope that a lot of the threats, a lot of the rhetoric that's being put out there, not to say that it's artificial, not to say that we shouldn't worry about it, but I think that we want to control what we can control and make those preparations based on the situation right now. So some of the reflections, at least I had, Balkan, from our discussion last week. So when Washington, D.C. was a little bit quieter the week before inauguration, basically was this, that one of the interesting things that came up in our discussion was, why can't Canada be treated like other U.S. allies? And the name Australia came to mind. And you be aware that many of our discussions kind of talk about Australia, and not to pick on Australia, but Australia is seen as the favorite ally now in Washington, D.C. And I think this goes to the bigger structural and strategic issue that we should be thinking about on the Can-US side. And I know we'll get into China and Russia later. That is, we could focus on the tariffs, and we could focus on, the potential countermeasures that we should be preparing for. We could focus on the border, for example, or we could have a bigger, more strategic lens and say, look, it's not just about the tariffs. It's not just about fentanyl. It's not just about the border. It's about the bigger strategic credibility of the way the United States sees its relationship with Canada. This goes into spending on national defense, of course, which we've talked about for quite a bit on this podcast and at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. This also goes into the way that we approach our adversaries and the seriousness the way we approach our adversaries, be it a revisionist Russia, be it People's Republic of China and Asia. So I think, I mean, again, going back to the first point of taking a bit of a moment to not to relax, but to reflect and actually try to see the bigger picture. Because I think what the United States wants out of its relationship with Canada is not a few measures on border security or trade, but I think it's a broader strategic package that includes all of these different things that we've been talking about for some time.
No, I mean, I think this is an extremely important point, and I think we need to be. I understand, especially understand the concern and the specific attention paid to the tariff stress coming out of the Trump administration, so on and so forth, given the existential nature of this economic relationship. But I think solely focusing on being reactive in a way, and solely focusing on that one particular dimension, and thinking that if we can, adjust the knobs here a little bit and do that and can avoid the problems down the road, I think misses the bigger picture. And going back to, I think, the theme of this podcast, in the grand scheme of things, there are two major threats to our security and prosperity out there. Those are Russia and China, and then you have your minions of Iran and North Korea and others going around. And we may have a family dispute here with the Americans on certain things, but it is important, and I think incumbent on everybody, including United States, Canada, and our Indo-Pacific and European allies, to recognize or put these things into perspective of what needs to be done to face this increasingly aligned, increasingly coordinated, and, as we see, increasingly belligerent adversaries, and how to deal with them. And I think we here at home also need to focus on and take a step back, as you pointed out, and say, look, if this is the bigger threat for us in the next 3, 5, 10 years going down the road, and what the United States and our other allies, European and Indo-Pacific allies, are expecting Canada to do to play the part in this broader, global West, collective West, whatever you want to name them. What do we need to do, and how does this, play out in Washington D.C., in Brussels, in Tokyo, etc. We need to think not parochially in this particular way, and short term of what can we do to avoid this particular thing, but what are the deeper causes of this, of the frustration from our allies, and what we can learn from other partners, Australia, Japan, our European allies. I think this is a broader discussion that we need to have as Western allies, because Canada, in that sense, is not the only one in this place. And Trump's style might be off-putting, but the kernel of arguments there about burden sharing, about partners to do better and more, is not going away, and it is right. And therefore, we need to sort of take ourselves outside of, this is not only about us. This is similar dynamics within the West. How can we rethink the Western alliance and its structure and the bargains that it struck, and what then we can bring to the table to ensure our own prosperity and security on the one hand, but also contribute to our friends and allies.
I would just, I fully agree with this, but I would just add a couple points on this as well, that really, I think this comes down to resilience too. And, of course, we saw one of the biggest threats to resilience recently during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the supply chains that were really pressed, and we saw how vulnerable we were on multiple different fronts. But I would say that we need to have a forward-looking view on resilience too. So if you see some of the challenges that we face from a traditional security perspective, putting aside for the moment, health, security, pandemics, climate risks, which are quite significant. But from a traditional security perspective, of course, we see Russia on the march. and now in Europe, launching one of the largest or reigniting one of the largest continental wars that Europe's had since World War II. But I think we need to have a capacity to think a little bit deeper. I'm not saying that there's going to be a Ukraine moment in 2025, but I think there's a lot of potential fragile areas, some of them potentially with very high geostrategic consequence for Canada, that we are one crisis away. You could already argue that we're basically at a capability tipping point right now, where not only can Canada not provide the national good of national defense for its own citizens and protecting its citizens overseas, but then there's the other point of being a reliable ally and ensuring as much as you can contributing to the national security of your allies, let alone the third point of which many Canadians enamor themselves with, which is this idea that providing international public goods. So we can't even get to number 3 if we can't take care of number 1 and number 2, which is the national defense of our own country and our citizens, and then ideally contributing to security of our closest allies, the United States in particular. So this takes me to this idea of having a more deeper scan of thinking about this coming year, and be it maybe over Taiwan, which of course is one of the areas that many people think about, but there could be other areas. I mean, are we confident in the stability of the China-India relationship, for example, in the coming months? Do we know exactly what's happening in the Americas? We see instability, for example, in Venezuela. We are 1 or 2 of these flashpoints away, I think, from compounding on the current flashpoints that we already have of just not having the ability to respond. And I think that should be deeply problematic, for the Canadian side, and should provoke some of these big questions. So, I will just close on this and point to the fact that MLIs, when talking, of course, a lot about a defense industrial base and putting more money into our national defense spending, I think we need to start thinking generationally on this rather than the idea of can we finally live up to our commitments, for example, on 2%. I do commend the Business Council, for example, coming out with their report talking about 3%. And I think that should be basically the baseline discussion right now for defense spending. So that's the type of thinking I think we need at this current juncture.
No, I mean, this is a great point to sort of dive deeper into what lies ahead, right? Some of the potential flashpoints. What do we need to watch for? Let me maybe just start with the sort of transatlantic space, Europe, and then we can sort of come from the other side through Asia and Indo-Pacific and back home here in North America and the Arctic. When I look at 2025, what lies ahead, I completely agree that this we're not dealing with a short-term acute threat. What we are dealing with is a chronic threat. In Europe, this is Russia. Russia is a chronic threat to peace and stability in Europe and by extension in the transatlantic space and in Canada. So we need to think generationally rather than hoping very naively and I would say delusionally that if something happens and solves the problem over there, if the hostilities briefly pause, we can go back to business as usual. There is no business as usual, right? 2025, I think one thing we need to watch out, well, 2 things to watch out when Canadians look at what's going on in Europe, is one, how the war will evolve in Ukraine. I know everybody talks about, Trump claimed that they're going to bring everybody to the table, have an agreement. And I was on record, and I'll go on record again. I do not expect a long-lasting ceasefire, and never mind a peace agreement happening in 2025. Even if Europeans and Americans and us decided to enforce or try to push Ukraine to some sort of a ceasefire, I do not see the Russians coming to table. So looking at 2025, I expect you might expect to see some kind of a facade of negotiations on the Putin side, because he wants to throw that out there. But on the ground, I would say that we will see more. We will see the intensification of the war, and we will see increasing fraying of social and economic and military ties in Europe and in Ukraine. Like, I think that's an important thing to remember, that this is getting into the third year, the fourth year of the war. Their patience, their resources, their resilience is not infinite. It is heroic, but it is important to note that unfortunately, 2025 will be a darker year um, uh, because we have a lot of issues. Europe is not at a place where they can actually supplant actually United States support in terms of hardware, ammunition, etc., etc. Financial, they might be able to provide, but the things that go boom may not necessarily be there. And Canada is nowhere close to producing or even thinking about producing those things. So 2025 will be quite dangerous. We are, I would say, at the war and the most dangerous and most perilous for Ukraine stage since spring of 2022 in the battle and in the front lines. So expect, unfortunately, more that destruction and continuing an intensifying war in Ukraine. The second thing I would say about Europe is that we need to here in Canada need to look at how Europe is, or whether Europe will get its act together when it comes to defense and security. That includes whether there will be sufficient financial resources. There are various mechanisms that are being promoted within Europe to invest in European defense capability. That the fruits of those efforts will take some number of years to come, but I think 2025 will be pivotal to see whether the European Union, particularly and with UK as well going forward, will put in place the necessary mechanisms, financial and regulatory and incentive structures that will lead to a proper rearming of Europe. Right? I think in that sense, in 2025, 25 will be the year we'll see whether Europe is serious in terms of being a real geopolitical actor or not. And some of this credit might probably have to go to Donald Trump in the sense of creating the panic in Europe and leading to doubts about whether the U.S. will be there all the time. And I would add maybe the third thing, what we can expect in 2025 in Europe. So Ukraine is going to get worse. It's a pivotal time for European defense and security, whether it's going to be a real actor. The third thing when we look at Europe is how internal politics will shake out. There are elections coming up in about a month in Germany. There will be presidential elections coming up in 2026, I think, in France. There are a number of other elections, a number of societal features and fissures are getting there. It is important, I think, for us to watch out to see what's happening at the domestic level in Europe with our allies, and pay attention how our adversaries, Russia and China, try to create wedge, deepen those wedges, and interfere and try to take advantage of potential societal tensions and tensions between allies, Europe, United States under Trump, Canada, etc. I think we need to be really, really watching out for potential subversion and taking advantage of by our enemies as we enter into a period of contestation within Europe. So Canadians really need to be paying attention of what's going on there, because we might also have it at home. But I talk too much, so let me turn to you. When we sort of slowly go towards Asia, maybe starting with India, but also moving on to East Asia and Indo-Pacific, what do you see? What can we expect in 2025?
Well, I mean, I'd like to be more optimistic, but I think some of the same themes, Balkan, you just talked about in Europe. I mean, hedging and wedging, the idea of taking vulnerabilities that might be there in the political ranks, et cetera, that adversaries, of course, China largely in the Indo-Pacific, but Russia also plays in the Indo-Pacific as well, and will continue to utilize itself as a spoiler. And we've clearly seen this with its relationship with North Korea, for example. But to back up a little bit, and sometimes I talk about a pessimism sandwich, which is both of the buns are pessimism, and you have optimism in the inside. Let's go with an optimism sandwich here. So on the pessimistic side, there are some structural challenges, and I think one of the challenges that I think is very important, especially because we have new leadership in Washington and we know how important personal relationships are to this president, will be the bereft lack of leadership in the Indo-Pacific. So if you zoom back to Trump 1.0, and many would joke that Trump's number one national security advisor was Abe Shinzo in Japan. I mean, he flew to New York and to Trump Tower and met with Trump before he was even inaugurated, and was ideally one of his sort of soothsayers within the G7 construct. Now, not only is the G7 a complicated mix of figures, mainly ones that Trump doesn't like, perhaps save Miss Maloney in Italy. In the Indo-Pacific, we just do not have that symbol of leadership that we once had. And it's not just Japan. Of course, we see, if we think of the U.S. main allies in the region, South Korea, of course, going through some very significant and worrying issues now with the impeachment of Yoon Suk-yeol, who would have probably, despite his flaws, been someone that President Trump actually would have got along with quite well and transacted with quite well. So we have this happening in South Korea. In Japan, while we still have the liberal Democrats, of course, who are still in power and are almost perpetually in power, we don't have the strong leadership of someone like an Abe Shinzo in power in Japan. We go further down south, of course, the other key bedrock ally is Australia. And structurally, there's many great things going on in that relationship. The AUKUS deal, despite its challenges, continues to go forward. But we have a leader there that is not a natural sort of dance partner with Donald Trump and the Republican Party there in Washington. So the reason I say this is structural issues and all of the work that the United States has put into the alliance structures, that will remain and that will still be very important. But I think we are in an era where personal relationships between the leaders matters a lot. And right now, when our adversaries are actually converging together, which is a big theme of our Double Trouble podcast, we're actually seeing a bit of the opposite, where we're seeing, of course, naturally in democracies, a lot of change. A lot of incumbents are losing their jobs. And we're lacking that strong level of leadership connection. The one sort of relationship I will point to, though, that I think has a lot of opportunity, of course, has some challenges in it that the Canadian side knows as well, is the India relationship and the potential for the U.S.-India relationship. So I think thinking about which Democratic leader would Donald Trump get along with the most in the Indo-Pacific, I mean, I can't think of many others other than Narendra Modi. I think that's a relationship of two huge personalities with a lot of converging interests, some challenges, of course, embedded as well. That really strikes me as one of the most consequential relationships that we should be paying attention to in 2025. In what direction is that relationship going to be going? Of course, we know that many in Trump's administration are very, very worried about China as the biggest geostrategic threat and actor, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but globally. How much will India continue to play with Washington on this? What will be the future, for example, of the Quad arrangement, which has been growing in recent years, but has had its challenges and roadblocks too. So I think that's one of the areas that I'd be focused on. And just to sort of come back to a little bit of optimism before I end on this is that, Asia's got a lot of the problems that Europe has. I mean, similar problems of political challenges, weak politicians, some parties that are quickly falling in and out of favor. On the positive side, when you talked about rearming and having a seriousness, Asia is actually the area of growth. I mean, whether you want to consider this a something to celebrate or something to be concerned about. But Asia is actually the area of growth when it comes to defense industry. Actually, we've seen in Europe that it's many of the Asian democracies. South Korea is an example that's helping to backfill some of the challenges of the lack of capabilities that NATO allies in Europe have. So while there are a host of other different challenges and intra rivalries within the region, one of the benefits is that the Asian states actually have been preparing for the possibility of conflict, obviously deterrence being the main goal, for several years. And I think you'll see the trajectory of that, whether it comes to innovation, defense spending, finding different ways to have arrangements with the United States as a principal ally. I think you'll actually see that on the uptick. So that's an area of positivity. And just sort of, a last sort of thing to note on tripwires and areas that we could see of challenge. I worry about the larger scale kinetic possibilities of something over Taiwan or South China Sea, but I think we're going to continue to see the land of 1,000 cuts. The Indo-Pacific has been this for the past 10 to 15 years, where you're seeing a slow gray zone erosion of the status quo. You see this around Taiwan in strategic terms, also in economic terms and diplomatic terms. I think you'll continue to see this in the South China Sea. And of course, one thing that I'll end on is, don't forget that while China, of course, is a huge part of the disruption in the Indo-Pacific, we have Russia there. We have Russia as one of the gatekeepers to the Arctic, and is increasingly working very much closely with the People's Republic of China on this. And then we have the wild card of North Korea, of course, which is a very, very dangerous wild card as well. Yes, it's a small, closed, authoritarian state, but increasingly with Russia's support and China's sort of silence, there's the potential for North Korea to be a much more concerning global security threat in the coming year.
No, I mean, in 2025, as you pointed out, it's pessimistic and more pessimistic with a side of pessimism. Looks like, and I think your point about gray zone aggression and shadow war, undeclared war on the West by both Russia and China, I think is going to be more and more in the news and in the eyes of the people and in the minds of the policymakers as we go through. I mean, we can have a whole new episode on that, and maybe we should go back to it. But from shadow fleets to sabotage, to assassinations in Europe, but to all sorts of use of criminal gangs and others to subvert and our societies, to engage in cyber attacks, as a number of new news stories in the past couple of weeks highlighting the role of China and the Chinese state-backed hackers, basically pre-positioning themselves to be able to cripple our infrastructure in case of a kinetic war, etc. I think that is, Canadians should expect to see more of that, and the intensification of the gray zone aggression against the West by Russia and China in 2025. Which brings me to the last thing I want to get in the last couple of minutes to talk a little bit, and back home. That is, when Canadians look at the Indo-Pacific, look at the across the Atlantic, and saw that the clouds are gathering aggression, gray zone aggression, and conventional aggression in Europe and elsewhere, gathering steam. Some might think that we might be, safe and secure away from all this. You and I and an increasing number of people recognize that is not the case, and that the war is here at home as well, particularly on the gray zone interference aspects of it. So maybe in a minute or two, what do you see as the primary thing that the Canadians need to be aware of when it comes to national security here at home, and the primary sort of vectors of attack from our adversaries, from Russia and China, and how the Canadians should expect the next government? You and I know that now we are everybody is in the sort of election mode. I don't expect much, unfortunately, from our current government to step up. But what should the next government, in a concrete way, what steps need to take in 2025 to deal with Russia and China here at home?
Well, I'll try to be really succinct on this, but I mean, I think it's a great question and a big question. I think the first thing is to, and I think it's sort of undergirded in a lot of this discussion, but national security and national security beyond our borders, the international realm as well, is not an elective. And I think the idea that it's something we can tick off on years that we have a budget surplus or something that we can add a little bit of extra to, clearly it's detrimental to the prosperity of our citizens and to the security of our citizens to do so. I think beyond going a little bit deeper though into Canada and how our adversaries think is that I think we have to look at, number one, what is the biggest comparative advantage that Canada has? We have a lot of national advantages, which I can get into too. But I think one of the biggest advantages that adversaries see, and I think the Chinese and the Russians are no different, is our geography. I mean, they see us as a backdoor, as a right next door to their biggest geopolitical foe, which is the United States. So I think there's ways we can leverage that for our interest, but there's ways that can be a massive vulnerability. And I think in recent years, the fact of us being targeted, whether it's in the cyber realm or in other sort of economic spheres, I think it has provided a vulnerability to the United States and to other members of the Western Alliance. So going a bit deeper on that and how the next government might look at this is I look at, not only our geography, but what are some of those very good comparative advantages that we have that are being exploited? I think, absolutely our critical minerals advantage and some of our energy security advantages. Not only, of course, are our adversaries happy when we're not able to export those and diversify away from other areas of fossil fuels, but I think they also see an opportunity in investing in those areas. So we're trying to close loopholes. We're trying to find ways to ensure that doesn't happen, but making sure that they don't cut us off at the knees at our biggest potential comparative advantage, I think is something that we really need to focus on. So yeah, as a closing note, I mean, when I would think national security and I would think about foreign policy for the next government, and again, I feel like a bit like a broken record on this, but I think we need to be talking about food security, agriculture, uranium, energy security, critical minerals, and of course, national defense and innovation as well. But I think that we need to be thinking about those things that are most valuable from the Canadian perspective, from resources, and what would be most targeted from our adversaries. So that's where I think foreign policy and national security starts, I think, with the next government.
No, this is excellent, and I would recommend our listeners to go and read Heather X. Napiero's recent piece at The Hub that looks at the natural resources and how Canada can and is an energy superpower, to be able to bring that to bear to support not only our own national security and prosperity, but also the security of our friends and allies. And I would also add at this note, the fact that I've been saying for a while that in the current era, the dichotomy, supposed dichotomy between guns versus butter, that is spending on security and defense versus social spending and welfare and spending on other things, is a false one. If we don't have the guns, soon we won't have the butter. And I think Canadians need to understand and recognize that we need to pay. This is something we have been saying for a while. This is the time to pay the national security premium, because that premium is the one that protects and enables our way of life, our prosperity, and defend our values and way of doing things. And we cannot skimp on that. That era is no longer here. We need to make some tough choices, and our leaders, this government, the current government, the next government, needs to be frank with the Canadians and bring that forward. But there is more to talk, and we'll continue this discussion in Double Trouble in the coming weeks. Once again, Double Trouble is generously supported by the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation's Canada office, and I am Balkan Devlen, Director of the Trust Atlantic Program, and I was joined today by my co-host, Johnson Berkshire Miller, who is the Director of National Security, Foreign Affairs, and National Defense here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. So until next time, be well.
Thank you.